The moment Frances Wilcox rode into Caldwell, Kansas on a Thursday afternoon in the late spring of 1879, she did so with a carpetbag strapped to her saddle, a pistol she barely knew how to use tucked into her boot, and a heart that had already been broken so thoroughly she was certain it would never mend itself again. The town of Caldwell sat near the Kansas Indian Territory border like a rough, wind-scoured jewel on the edge of the frontier, and it was the sort of place that swallowed people whole if they let it. It had saloons that never seemed to close, cattle drives that thundered through its main street with enough noise to rattle the teeth loose from a man's jaw, and a population of cowboys, traders, drifters, and shopkeepers who all carried their own particular brand of desperation beneath their weathered exteriors. Frances had heard about Caldwell from a woman she had met at a way station outside of Wichita, a stout woman named Dolores who had pressed a name into her hand, along with a folded piece of paper that read, "Mabel Hatch runs a decent boarding house. She does not ask questions." Frances had needed someone who did not ask questions. She was 26 years old, which in the eyes of many in that time and place made her something of an old maid, though she would have laughed bitterly at anyone who said so to her face. She had dark auburn hair that she kept braided and pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat, green eyes that a man in another life had once told her were the color of sage after rain, and a mouth that had learned over the years to hold itself in a line that gave nothing away. She had come from St. Louis originally, where she had been married for 3 years to a man named Gerald Wilcox, a man who had seemed decent enough at the outset and then revealed himself, slowly and then all at once, to be neither decent nor kind. When Gerald had died of a fever the previous winter, Frances had mourned him the appropriate amount, and then she had mourned the loss of the version of herself she had been before she met him. And then she had packed everything she owned into a single carpetbag, sold the furniture Gerald had bought on credit he never intended to repay, and pointed herself west. She had no particular destination in mind when she started. She simply needed to be moving, because being still felt too much like the life she had just escaped. Mabel Hatch's boarding house sat on the east end of Caldwell's Main Street, a 2-story wooden structure that leaned very slightly to the left, as though it had once tried to walk somewhere and then thought better of it. Mabel herself was a woman of about 50 with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes that saw everything but chose to comment on very little, and she showed Frances to a room on the 2nd floor that looked out over the cattle pens at the edge of town. It smelled of sawdust and old lavender water and something else Frances could not quite identify, something that was not unpleasant, and she set her carpetbag down on the narrow bed and stood at the window for a long time looking at the wide Kansas sky going orange and pink in the west. "Supper is at 6, Mabel said from the doorway. "Breakfast at 7. I run a clean house." "I appreciate that," Frances said. "You looking for work?" Mabel asked, and the question was direct but not unkind. "I can sew," Frances said. "I can keep books. I did the accounting for my husband's hardware business for 2 years. Mabel nodded slowly. "There is a man named Patterson who runs the general store at the other end of town. His wife does the books, but she is expecting their 3rd child any week now, and I imagine she will need help. I can send word if you like." "I would appreciate that very much," Frances said. She unpacked her carpetbag that evening while the sounds of Caldwell rose from below, the distant laughter from the saloons, the lowing of cattle, the occasional sharp crack of a pistol that made her flinch even though she had told herself she was no longer a woman who flinched at sudden sounds. She hung her 2 spare dresses on the hook behind the door, set her small Bible on the windowsill not because she was particularly religious but because it had belonged to her mother, and then she sat on the edge of the bed and breathed until her heartbeat settled. She was here. She was alive. That was enough for tonight. She did not sleep well that first night, but she did sleep, and in the morning she went down to breakfast and met the other boarders. A quiet man named Elias who was a telegraph operator at the train depot, a young woman named Charlotte who worked as a seamstress and had an infectious laugh that made Frances smile despite herself, and a man with a sun-darkened face, and the kind of stillness that Frances associated with men who had spent a great deal of time outdoors alone. His name was Clayton Donovan, and he said very little at breakfast beyond good morning and please pass the bread. But Frances noticed the way he held himself, with the easy, unhurried certainty of someone who knew exactly where he stood in any given room. He was somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and brown eyes the color of good river clay, and his hands were the hands of a working man, scarred and calloused and capable-looking. He wore a plain flannel shirt and suspenders, no gun visible at breakfast, but Frances could tell from the way he moved that he was a man accustomed to carrying one. She did not think much about him that first morning. She had not come to Caldwell to think about men. The job at Patterson's general store materialized within the week, just as Mabel had predicted. Sarah Patterson, enormous with her third pregnancy and exhausted beyond the capacity for gentleness, handed Frances a ledger book with barely concealed relief and told her that invoices came in on Tuesdays and payments went out on Fridays, and if anything was unclear she could ask her husband, though in her experience the man understood cattle far better than he understood numbers. Frances sat down with the ledger the first morning and understood within an hour that the accounts were in considerably more disarray than anyone had admitted, but she set to work with the quiet, methodical attention that had always been her best quality in difficult situations, and by the end of her first week she had sorted out the discrepancies and presented Mr. Patterson with a balance sheet that made him go slightly pale and then very grateful. "You can stay as long as you like," he said. "Name your wage." She named a fair one, and he agreed to it without argument, which told her that the disarray had been worse than even she had realized. The work was good for her. It gave her something to occupy her mind from 7 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, and it gave her a reason to be somewhere and to be useful, which had always mattered to her more than people might have expected from looking at her. She began to know Caldwell in the way that a person who is paying attention comes to know a place. The rhythms of it, the characters, the unspoken rules and alliances, and the barely concealed tensions. She learned that the cattle season brought a particular kind of chaos to the town, with trail hands arriving from the south full of weeks of pent-up wages and energy. She learned that Sheriff Martin Doss was a fair man who did his job without cruelty, which was rarer than it should have been. She learned that the tension between the established settlers and the cattle interests ran hot and sometimes dangerous, and that the proximity of the Indian Territory just south of the Kansas line meant that Caldwell existed in a sort of permanent state of negotiation between different worlds. She also, gradually and without particularly meaning to, began to notice Clayton Donovan. He was a working cowboy. She learned from Charlotte one evening on the boarding house porch while the two of them watched the last light drain from the sky. He worked for a rancher named Herschel Grady, whose spread sat about 12 miles east of Caldwell, but he kept his room at Mabel's through the season because the Grady ranch was short on bunkhouse space, and Mabel's was convenient and cheap enough. He had been working cattle since he was 15, Charlotte said, had come originally from somewhere in Missouri, though he never talked about it much, and had a reputation among the Caldwell regulars as a man who was reliable, skilled, and fundamentally decent in a time and place where those qualities did not always go together. "He is quiet," Frances observed. "He is," Charlotte agreed, "but not in an unsettling way. In the way of a man who has decided that words are worth something, and so he does not waste them." Frances thought that was as fair a description as any. The first real conversation she had with him happened in the middle of June, about 3 weeks after she had arrived, on a morning when she came down to breakfast to find the dining room otherwise empty and Clayton already seated with a cup of coffee, staring out the window at the quiet street. He looked up when she came in and said good morning, and she said good morning back. And then, because she was not a woman who enjoyed unnecessary silence. She sat down across from him and poured herself coffee from the pot on the table. "You work for Grady," she said. "I do," he said. "Charlotte says you have been cowboying since you were 15. "That is about right," he said. He looked at her with a directness that she found more refreshing than intrusive. "You came from St. Louis." "Mabel talks," Frances said, though without heat. "She does," he agreed. "Not unkindly." "No," Frances conceded. "Not unkindly." There was a pause that was not quite comfortable but was not quite uncomfortable either, the kind of pause that happens between two people who are still calibrating each other. "Do you like it?" she asked. "The work, I mean. The cattle." He considered this as though it were a question worth considering, which she appreciated. "It suits me," he said finally. "I am not a man who does well penned up. The range gives a man room to think." "And what do you think about?" she asked, and she was not sure why she asked it because it was more intimate a question than she had intended, but it was out of her mouth before she could reconsider. He smiled then, and it was a slow, warm thing that changed the whole quality of his face. "Mostly cattle," he said. "Sometimes the weather. Occasionally what I am going to do when I am too old to sleep on the ground." Frances laughed, and it surprised her, the ease of it. She had not laughed easily in a long time. "That is a very practical set of concerns," she said. "I am a very practical man," he said. Mabel appeared then with a plate of biscuits, and the moment shifted into the ordinary flow of morning. But something had changed. Some door had opened a fraction that had been closed before, and Frances was aware of it even as she told herself it did not mean anything. The summer came in full and blazing over the Kansas plains, and with it came the trail herds from Texas, enormous rivers of longhorn cattle that poured up the Kishom Trail and into Caldwell with enough noise and smell and general commotion to overwhelm the senses. Frances had grown accustomed by now to the rhythms of the town, but the driving season was a different creature entirely, and she watched it with wide eyes from her post behind the counter at Patterson's store, while cowboys in trail-worn clothes crowded the streets, and the saloons across the way roared with an energy that seemed barely contained. Clayton was away more during those weeks, out at the Grady spread helping with the receiving end of the cattle business, sorting and tallying and managing the logistics of a large operation. Frances was surprised to find that she noticed his absence more than she would have predicted. The boarding-house table felt quieter. She caught herself more than once looking toward his empty chair at supper before she made herself stop. She began to understand that she was developing feelings she had not asked for and did not particularly want, not because of anything wrong with Clayton Donovan, but because of everything that was wrong with the last time she had let herself feel this way. She had loved Gerald Wilcox, or believed she had, and she had learned over the course of their marriage that love alone was not armor against a person's character revealing itself. She had learned that she was capable of being very wrong about a man, and that being very wrong had cost her things she would never get entirely back. Her confidence in her own judgment, for one. Her willingness to be vulnerable, for another. She had rebuilt herself out of the ruins of that marriage with hard work and deliberate solitude, and she was not at all certain she was ready to hand anything of herself to anyone again. She told herself this, firmly and rationally, on a Tuesday evening while sitting in the parlor of the boarding house mending a tear in one of her dresses. Clayton came in from outside a few minutes later, trail dust still on him, and stopped when he saw her in the lamplight. "Good evening," he said. "Good evening," she said. He poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher on the side table, and then stood for a moment as though he was going to go upstairs, and then instead he sat down in the chair across from her and looked at the middle distance for a moment. "Long day?" she asked. "Long week," he said. He leaned his elbows on his knees and rubbed his face with both hands, and for a moment he looked tired in the kind of bone-deep way that has nothing to do with sleep. Then he straightened and looked at her, and the tiredness receded, not entirely, but enough. "The accounts are settling out all right at Patterson's?" he asked, because Caldwell was a small enough town that her work there was common knowledge. "They are coming right," she said. "It is satisfying work. I like it when the numbers behave themselves. And when they do not, then I make them," she said, and something in the way she said it made him laugh, a genuine, full laugh that she felt somewhere in the center of her chest. "I believe you would," he said. They talked that evening for 2 hours, longer than either of them had intended, ranging from the practical to the personal in the gradual way of two people who are discovering that the other person's company is something they have been hungry for without knowing it. He told her about his years working cattle, about the particular freedom of the open range and the particular loneliness of it, about a winter he had spent in Colorado that he still considered the most beautiful and most miserable experience of his life. She told him about St. Louis, about the life she had built there, carefully and deliberately leaving the worst of Gerald out of it, though she spoke honestly about the marriage having ended in a way she had not expected or wanted. He did not pry. He listened with the same unhurried attention he seemed to bring to everything, and she appreciated that more than she could easily say. When Mabel came down at 9 o'clock to announce that she was locking the front door and everyone ought to be settled, they both looked up with the slightly startled expression of people who have lost track of time. "Apologies, Mabel," Clayton said. "No need for apology," Mabel said, and she gave Frances a look that Frances decided to ignore. She went to bed that night and lay in the dark listening to the distant sounds of Caldwell winding down, and told herself again, firmly, that she was not going to let this happen. She was not going to make herself vulnerable again. She was not going to trust her own heart because her own heart had led her wrong before, and she had paid dearly for it. She believed this completely, or almost completely, which was not quite the same thing. July arrived, and with it a particular kind of heat that pressed down on the Kansas plains like a hand, and Frances and Clayton had somehow settled into a habit of talking in the evenings on the boarding house porch, sometimes with Charlotte present and sometimes not. And Frances noticed that she counted the days when he was out at the Grady spread by the absence of those evenings, and that she stopped counting herself as a woman who was not going to let this happen, and started counting herself as a woman who was not sure what was happening but was, against her better judgment, no longer trying to prevent it. He brought her a wildflower one evening, not with ceremony, just held out a bright yellow prairie flower as he dropped into the chair beside her on the porch, and said he had seen a whole field of them east of town and thought she might like one. She took it and turned it in her fingers and looked at the yellow petals against her palm and felt something shift in her chest that she recognized, painfully and precisely, as the beginning of love. She told herself she was being foolish. She smelled the flower anyway. It was a Thursday evening in mid-July, when things became undeniable. The air had cooled slightly after a brief and violent thunderstorm that had rolled through mid-afternoon, and the sky had gone that particular wash-clean blue that only exists after summer storms on the plains. She and Clayton were on the porch, and he had told her something that had made her laugh, and she was looking at him while he looked out at the street, and she thought, "I am going to fall in love with this man if I am not already there, and I do not know what to do about that." As though he felt her looking, he turned, and their eyes met, and there was a moment of silence that was completely different from any silence they had shared before. It held something. Something that had been building since that first morning over coffee and was now too large to fit in the pretense that it was nothing. "Frances," he said, and just her name, the way he said it with a kind of careful attention, made her want to stand up and walk away from the porch and from Caldwell and from the feeling entirely. She did not stand up. "I know," she said instead, which was perhaps the most honest thing she had said in months. He was quiet for a moment. "I am not a man who says things he does not mean," he said, "so I will not say anything tonight that I am not certain of, but I think you know what I would like to say." "I think I do," she said, and she looked out at the street at the long blue evening, at the horses tied to the hitching posts and the lamplight beginning to glow in the windows of the buildings across the way. She thought about Gerald and about St. Louis and about the person she had been before and the person she was now. "I am afraid," she said, and it cost her something to say it. "Not of you, of myself, of being wrong again." "Tell me," he said quietly, and she did. Not everything, not all at once, but more than she had told anyone since leaving St. Louis. She told him about Gerald and the slow revelation of his character, and the years of managing herself carefully in a marriage that had required her to become smaller than she was. She told him about the loneliness of it and the shame of it, and the way it had made her doubt her own ability to see people clearly. She told him about the winter Gerald had died, and about the morning she had stood in the kitchen of their house in St. Louis looking at her own reflection in the window glass and not recognizing the woman looking back. Clayton listened without interruption until she was finished. Then he said, "I am sorry that you went through that. And I am sorry that the person who should have kept you safe did not." "I do not want to be kept safe," she said, and realized as she said it that it was true. "I want to be respected. I want to be seen. I want to be with someone who does not require me to be less than I am." "That is what I want for you too," he said, "and I would like very much if you will allow it to try to be that person." She looked at him for a long time. "I cannot promise you forever," she said finally. "I cannot promise that I will not be afraid, or that the fear will not sometimes make me difficult, or that I know with any certainty what I am capable of any more." He held her gaze with a steadiness that she found in that moment the most beautiful thing she had ever seen in a man. "Start with today," he said, "and we will see." She did not cry because she had made herself a rule about crying in front of people after Gerald, but her throat tightened and her eyes went bright, and she looked away at the street for a moment until she had herself in hand again. When she looked back at him, he was watching her with a patience that was not expectation, just presence. "Today," she said. "Today," he agreed. He did not reach for her hand or attempt to kiss her, and she appreciated the restraint of it. He simply sat with her in the blue evening until Mabel called them in for supper, and that was enough. That was more than enough. Things changed between them after that, and did not change, which is the nature of a truth that has been spoken aloud. They were still the same two people who had coffee in the morning and talked on the porch in the evenings, but now there was an acknowledged current beneath it, warm and steady and growing. He began to make small gestures that cost nothing individually, but accumulated into something significant. Saving her the seat by the window at breakfast that she preferred, riding past Patterson's store on his way back from the Grady spread, and stopping in to ask if she needed anything from the market. She began to do the same in her own way, keeping back a biscuit from breakfast on the mornings he had to leave before Mabel served, noting in conversation things she had read or observed that she thought would interest him. Charlotte noticed, of course. Charlotte noticed everything. "You are in a considerably better mood than when you arrived," Charlotte said one afternoon while they sat sewing on the porch. "I am settling into Caldwell," Frances said. "You are settling into someone in Caldwell," Charlotte said, and her expression was so warm and knowing that Frances could not even summon the energy to pretend. "I am terrified," Frances said. "Of course you are," Charlotte said. "That is how you know it is real." It was real. Frances knew it was real on an afternoon in late July, when Clayton arrived back from the Grady spread earlier than expected, and found her at the store counter flustered and frustrated, because she had discovered a significant discrepancy in the accounts that suggested someone, likely a supplier, had been systematically overcharging Patterson for 2 months. She was neck-deep in ledger books and invoice papers when the bell above the door rang and Clayton walked in, and before she could even say hello, she had turned the ledger around and pointed to the column of numbers and said, "Do you see what this supplier has done here?" He came around the counter without hesitation, leaned over the ledger and looked. He was close enough that she could smell the outdoors on him, sun and grass and horse, and she was aware of it, and then she was looking at the numbers again because the numbers were important. "That is a consistent 12% overcharge," he said. "Every invoice. Every invoice for 8 weeks, she confirmed. "I am going to have to draft a letter to Patterson about this." "And to the supplier," Clayton said. "The supplier is getting a considerably less polite letter," she said, and he laughed. And she was so pleased that he had come in when he had, and so pleased that he had looked at the ledger without question, and so pleased by his laugh that she had to make herself look back at the numbers before she did something impractical. He helped her organize the documentation that afternoon, sitting at the small table in the back of the store with his hat on his knee, sorting invoices while she made notes, and they talked while they worked in the easy, overlapping way of two people who have grown comfortable enough to let their conversations wander. Mr. Patterson came back from his midday meal and found them thus, and looked between them with an expression of mild astonishment. "You have roped a cowboy into doing bookkeeping," he said to Frances. "He volunteered," she said. "I did," Clayton said, unapologetically. Patterson shook his head and went back to the front of the store, muttering something that neither of them could quite make out, but that sounded, Frances thought, essentially approving. The letter to the supplier was sent the following week, and resulted in a satisfying and prompt reimbursement, which Patterson announced at church on Sunday as though Frances had personally recovered gold from a mine, which she found embarrassing but which Clayton, sitting beside her in the pew, seemed to find genuinely delightful. August came, and with it came heat so intense it shimmered off the surface of the main street in visible waves, and the cattle traffic increased further and the town was loud with it. Frances had by now become a familiar enough figure in Caldwell that people greeted her by name on the street, and the women of the church sewing circle had invited her twice, both times more sincerely than the first. She had not quite accepted, because she was not sure she was ready to be that rooted anywhere yet, but she was considering it. She and Clayton had not yet kissed. They had not formally declared anything to each other beyond that evening on the porch, but they existed in a state of acknowledged mutual feeling that was understood by everyone who saw them together, which is to say by everyone in Caldwell. Mabel had taken to setting their breakfast places next to each other without comment. Charlotte had begun making small smiling expressions whenever they were in the same room that Frances threatened, regularly and affectionately, to address. The kiss happened on a Saturday afternoon when Frances had finished early at the store and gone to the edge of town, where there was a particular rise she had discovered in her first weeks there, a gentle swell of ground above the cattle pens from which you could see the plains spreading out in every direction for what felt like forever. She went there sometimes when she needed to think, or when she needed to remember that the world was very large and that she was a small and free figure moving through it, which was not a bad thing to be. She did not expect Clayton to be there. He was, sitting on the rise with his arms resting on his knees, hat pushed back, looking south toward the Indian Territory line. He heard her coming and turned, and his expression when he saw her was so openly glad that it struck her like a physical thing, warm and straight through the chest. She sat down beside him and they looked at the plains together in comfortable silence for a while. "I have been thinking," she said eventually. "About." She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her, and that straightforward, unhurried attention of his was on her full and unguarded, and she thought, "I trust this man." The realization arrived not as a surprise but as the acknowledgement of something that had been true for some time without her officially giving it permission to be true. "I have been thinking," she said again, "that I am less afraid than I was." "I am glad," he said. "I am not entirely unafraid," she said, because honesty was something she had decided she owed both of them. "But the fear is smaller than it was, and I think that counts for something." "It counts for a great deal," he said. She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on his knee, and he turned his hand over so that their palms met, and his fingers closed around hers with the gentle, deliberate certainty of someone handling something they consider precious. She looked down at their hands together against the sun-bleached grass and then looked up at his face. He kissed her softly, just once, with his free hand coming up to cup her jaw the way you would hold something you did not want to damage, And it was nothing like any kiss she had experienced before because there was nothing in it of possession or expectation, only warmth and care, and the unhurried quality that she was beginning to understand was simply who he was. She put her other hand against his chest, feeling his heartbeat under her palm, and thought with perfect clarity, today is where I am. And today is very good. They rode back into Caldwell together in the long gold light of the late afternoon, their horses side by side on the rutted trail, and neither of them said very much, but neither of them needed to. August unfolded around them in a series of days that Frances would later think of as the richest of her life up to that point. Not because great events occurred, but because of the quality of attention she was learning to bring to ordinary things. The smell of coffee in the morning, the weight of a ledger book balanced on her knees, the sound of Clayton's voice on the porch in the evening telling her about something he had seen out on the range that had struck him as remarkable. A hawk that had flown alongside him for half a mile, a storm that had built up to the west in the shape of something almost architectural. The way certain evenings, the grass turned a color he could only describe as bronze. She loved him. She knew it by now with the kind of certainty that is not loud but is absolute, the way you know your own name or the layout of a room you have lived in for a long time. She had not said it yet, and neither had he, because they were both people who believed that words that large deserved to be said at the right moment, not scattered about carelessly. There were difficulties, of course, because life does not suspend itself to accommodate love. In early September, there was trouble at the Grady spread. Clayton came in from a long day with a tightness around his jaw that she recognized as controlled worry, and when she asked, he told her that Herschel Grady had gotten into a dispute with a neighboring rancher named Olin Prout over water rights on a creek that ran between their properties, a dispute that had been simmering all summer and had boiled over that afternoon when Prout's men had rerouted a section of the creek with deliberate malice, cutting off water access to the eastern pasture where Grady was running his breeding stock. Water rights disputes in the West of 1879 were not trivial matters. They had a way of turning into exactly the kind of violence that Frances had learned to be wary of. "Grady wants to go to Prout's place tonight," Clayton said, "with enough men to make a point." "That is an extremely bad idea," Frances said. "It is," he agreed. "I spent the better part of the afternoon talking him back from it. And he has agreed to let me ride over to talk to Prout in the morning, just me and one other man, a conversation instead of a confrontation." Frances looked at him. "You will go to Prout's ranch alone?" "With one man," he said. "That is still essentially alone," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I am a careful man, Frances." "I know that," she said. "I also know that careful men can find themselves in bad situations when the other parties involved are not careful." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his briefly, a gesture of reassurance that she appreciated even as she continued to be worried. He went the next morning early, before breakfast, and she spent the day at Patterson's store doing accounts with a concentration that she had to work considerably harder than usual to maintain. When he rode back into Caldwell in the late afternoon and appeared in the doorway of the store with his hat in his hand and no visible damage to his person, the relief that moved through her was so strong it was almost dizzying. "How did it go?" she asked. "Prout is a stubborn man, but not a completely unreasonable one," Clayton said. "We have agreed to bring both parties before the county commissioner next week to establish the water rights formally. Grady is not happy about waiting, but he will wait." "Good," she said. "That is good." "You were worried," he said, not quite making it a question. "I was," she said. "I make no apology for that." "I would not ask for one," he said. The water rights dispute was eventually settled by the county commissioner in Grady's favor after a formal review, and it became one of those resolved tensions that Caldwell filed away and moved on from, because there was always another one coming. But it had shown Frances something important, that her feelings for Clayton were deep enough now that his safety was wound into her own sense of the world's stability, and that this fact no longer frightened her in the way it once would have. September ripened toward October, and the driving season wound down, and the cattle traffic through Caldwell thinned as the trail herds reached their various destinations, and the riders dispersed until next spring. The town shifted gear into its quieter autumn self, and Frances found she liked it better this way, liked the slower pace and the clearer streets and the sense of Caldwell settling into itself. It was on one of these quieter evenings, a Thursday in early October with the first real bite of autumn in the air, that Clayton took her to supper at the restaurant that had opened on the far end of Main Street in August. It was not a fancy establishment, being essentially a large room with mismatched tables and a menu that consisted of whatever the cook felt like making. But it was better than boarding house food, and it had candles on the tables in the evening, which gave it a warmth that Frances appreciated. They sat across from each other and ate roasted chicken and talked about everything and nothing, ranging through topics with the ease of two people who have learned each other well. And at some point the candle between them burned low enough that the light it cast was very warm and very close, and Clayton looked at her across the table with an expression she had never seen on him before, or had seen only in pieces until now. Open, unguarded, and full of something so large it was almost frightening in its scope. "I love you," he said. It was simple and direct and completely unadorned, and it landed in her chest like a stone dropping into still water, sending out rings. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the morning she had arrived in Caldwell with her carpetbag and her borrowed pistol and her broken-down heart. She thought about that first cup of coffee across the breakfast table, and the wildflower and his hand turning over to hold hers on the rise above the cattle pens. She thought about all the todays she had chosen, one at a time, since that evening on the porch. "I love you," she said back, and saying it felt like setting something down that she had been carrying for a very long time without quite realizing how heavy it was. He reached across the table and took her hand, and the candle guttered and then caught again, and outside the restaurant window Caldwell went about its evening business entirely unaware that anything significant had just happened inside, which is the way of significant things. What came after was not a sudden arrival at some perfect destination, but rather the deepening of something already in motion, which is more true to how love actually works than most stories would have you believe. October passed in a slow golden fall across the Kansas plains, and Frances began to sit closer to Clayton on the porch in the evenings because the nights were cooler now, and because she wanted to. He began to reach for her hand without thinking about it, as naturally as breathing, which was how she knew the gesture was real. He asked her in late October if she would like to ride out to the Grady spread with him one Saturday, not for any particular reason other than that he wanted to show her what his days were like, and she said yes. She had not ridden much before coming west, but she had gotten better at it over the summer, and the ride east of Caldwell through the autumn-brown prairie was one of the most beautiful things she had seen since arriving in Kansas. The light was different out there away from the town, low and golden and very clear, and the grass moved in the wind in long, rhythmic waves that she found hypnotic. Herschel Grady was a barrel-shaped man in his 60s with an impressively full beard and the suspicious, assessing eyes of someone who had spent decades judging the quality of livestock and had applied the same methodology to people. He looked at Frances with that assessment for about 30 seconds and then reached out to shake her hand and said, "Clayton says you sorted out Patterson's accounts. Man's been getting robbed by suppliers for years. It is about time someone noticed." "It is about time he hired someone who could read a ledger," Frances said. Grady let out a bark of laughter and exchanged a look with Clayton that said, rather clearly, "I see why you like her." The Grady spread was not large as ranches went in that era, but it was well run, and Frances spent part of the afternoon watching Clayton work, moving among the cattle with the fluid, unhurried competence of someone who has done something so long it has become part of his body's understanding of how to be in the world. She watched him and thought that she was watching someone exactly in their right place, exactly themselves, and she found it deeply affecting in a way she would have struggled to fully articulate. On the ride back toward Caldwell in the late afternoon, the sun going down behind them and painting the plains in shades of copper and rose, he asked her, carefully and without pressure, what she thought she might do, whether she planned to stay in Caldwell. She thought about it while their horses walked side by side on the trail. "I like it here," she said. "I like the work and I like the town and I like the people I have found here." She paused. "I like you." "That is a considerable understatement," he said with a small, warm smile. "I do not want to make promises I cannot keep," she said. "I told you that at the beginning." "You did," he said, "but I am still here," she said, "and I intend to keep being here one day at a time for as long as I can see ahead." He reached across the space between their horses and put his hand briefly on hers where it rested on the pommel. "That is everything," he said. November arrived, and with it a coldness that was no longer pleasant, and that drove Frances indoors in the evenings where she was glad of Mabel's well-built boarding house and the coal stove in the parlor that glowed red in the evenings. Clayton was working reduced hours at the Grady spread as the winter operations required less labor, and he spent more evenings at Mabel's, reading or talking with the other boarders, or sitting beside Frances at the parlor table where she did her accounts, and he did nothing in particular, which was a form of company she had come to value deeply. It was in November that Charlotte announced she was leaving Caldwell. A seamstress position had come open in Dodge City at a proper dressmaker's shop, a real establishment with a good reputation, and the wages were significantly better than what she was making here. She was excited and sad in equal measure, and Frances helped her pack and stood on the platform at the train depot with her and hugged her tight when the train arrived. "You will be all right," Charlotte told her, holding Frances by the shoulders. "Better than all right. That man loves you something fierce and you love him back and you are braver than you know." "Go," Frances said, "before I am not dignified about this." Charlotte laughed and kissed her cheek and was on the train, and then the train was moving, and Frances stood on the platform in the November cold until it was out of sight. Clayton was standing a few feet behind her. She knew without turning, because that was where he had been when Charlotte came out of the boarding house and loaded her bags onto the wagon that morning, present and unobtrusive in the way that was his particular form of caring for people. She turned and he was there, and she walked toward him, and he put his arm around her shoulders in a gesture that was warm and easy and entirely natural, and they walked back to the boarding house together through the cold November morning without needing to say very much. She missed Charlotte, but she was not alone. December came in hard and cold and beautiful over the Kansas plains, bringing skies of an almost impossible blue on clear days and an occasional light snow that covered the prairie in white and made Caldwell look, for a few days at a time, like a painting of itself. Frances had never experienced a plains winter, and she found it both more brutal and more magnificent than she had anticipated. There was a community Christmas gathering at the church on the 20th of December, a warm and crowded event that smelled of pine branches and mulled cider, and people who had not seen each other since the harvest season and were making up for lost conversation. Frances went with Clayton and with Mabel and with Elias the telegraph operator, and she sat beside Clayton through the carol singing with his arm along the back of the pew behind her, and she thought, "I am happy." Not the careful, provisional happiness of someone who is waiting for the other shoe to drop, but something larger and more settled, something that felt like a foundation. She thought about that feeling later that evening when they were the last ones in the parlor, the fire burned down to comfortable embers, everyone else gone to bed. "Clayton," he said, looking up from the book he had been reading. "I want to stay," she said, "not just one day at a time. I want to stay." He set the book down and looked at her with the full weight of that unhurried attention. "In Caldwell," he said, making sure he understood. "In Caldwell," she said, "with you, whatever form that takes. I'm not running from anything anymore, and I'm not moving toward anything except here." He was quiet for a moment that felt very significant. "Then stay," he said. "I will be here." "You are always here," she said, and she meant it as simply the statement of a fact that had come to be one of the defining features of her world. He reached over and took her hand, and they sat by the dying fire for another hour without saying much at all, and it was one of the best hours Frances could remember in years. The winter deepened, and with it came the kind of enforced closeness that a frontier winter produces, with the town's various residents drawing inward and the boarding house becoming a more sociable place than it was in the warmer months when people scattered to the four winds. Elias proved to have a previously concealed talent for card games and presided over many an evening entertainment at the parlor table, and Mabel turned out to know an astonishing number of hymns and folk songs and could be persuaded, on the right evenings, to sing them. 2 new boarders had arrived in November, a schoolteacher named Agnes who was waiting for the new schoolhouse to be finished before she officially started, and a young man named Billy who worked at the train depot and seemed determined to be cheerful regardless of circumstances. Frances found herself genuinely fond of all of them in a way that surprised her. She had arrived in Caldwell as a woman who had pulled her life in tight around herself for protection, and she was discovering that she had, without quite planning it, let it expand again. Clayton asked her to marry him on the first day of the new year, 1880. He did it quietly, not at a moment of great ceremony, but in the early morning while they stood at the kitchen window watching the snow fall on the empty Main Street, Mabel not yet up, the house still silent. He had a cup of coffee in one hand and he put it down on the windowsill and turned to her and said, in his direct, unhurried way, "I would like you to marry me, Frances. Not because I think that is the natural next step in any prescribed order of things, but because I want to spend my days with you specifically, and I want to do it in the most official and lasting capacity available to us." She looked at him for a long time. The snow fell outside, soft and steady. "I said I could not promise forever," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to promise forever. I am asking you to choose now and let now be the thing we build on." She looked out at the snow, and then back at him, at his steady face and his honest eyes and his hands, those capable, careful hands. "Yes," she said. He smiled then, that slow, warm smile that had been working its way through her defenses since the beginning, and he pulled her into his arms and held her against his chest, and she felt the steady beat of his heart and thought, today, and all the todays after it. They were married in March of 1880 in the Caldwell church, a small ceremony because neither of them was a person given to large gestures, with Mabel and Elias and Agnes and Billy, and the Pattersons and Herschel Grady and half of Caldwell's established population present in the pews. Frances wore her best dress, which was a deep green wool that she had taken in and embellished herself over the winter, and Clayton wore his good shirt and had made an effort with his hair that she found, privately, quite touching. The minister asked them to say their vows and Frances said hers in a clear, steady voice, looking Clayton full in the face. And when the minister asked if he took this woman, Clayton said "I do" with such uncomplicated conviction that Mabel, sitting in the front row, made a small sound that she quickly converted into a cough. Afterward there was a celebration at the largest saloon in Caldwell, which was the only space in town big enough to hold everyone, and they pushed the tables back and there was fiddle music and someone had produced several jugs of something that went down smooth and kicked hard. And Frances danced for the first time in years, unself-consciously and with tremendous joy, first with Clayton, and then with Elias, who turned out to be a surprisingly excellent dancer. And then with Clayton again, who was not a particularly excellent dancer, but who danced with her as though he was deeply pleased to be doing so, which was considerably better than technical skill. The spring of 1880 found them setting up a household together. Clayton had, over the winter, been in negotiation with a landowner east of Caldwell about a small parcel of land that had a modest house on it, 2 rooms and a good roof, and a barn that needed work but was structurally sound. It sat on the edge of the open range with a view of the plains in every direction and a creek that ran reliably along its southern edge. And when he brought Frances out to see it the first time, she stood in the yard and turned in a slow circle looking at the sky and said, "Yes, this is it." They moved in April, when the weather was warm enough to make moving comfortable, and the prairie was beginning to green up, and the process of making the house their own was one of the happiest projects Frances had undertaken. She was a practical woman and an inventive one, and she knew how to make the most of limited materials, and she threw herself into the work with an energy that was part homemaking and part joy, and part the particular satisfaction of a person who is, for the first time in their life, building something that is entirely their own. Clayton worked the Grady spread during the week and came home every evening, which was a different arrangement than the bunkhouse life he had lived before, and which he settled into with the same unhurried ease that characterized his approach to most things. He was a man who was good at being home, Frances discovered. He was good at the ordinary daily work of it, the maintenance and repair, the tending of the small kitchen garden she put in that spring, the management of the 3 horses they now owned between them. He was good at sitting at the supper table at the end of the day and being present, which was something she had not previously known she needed so much. They had a garden that summer that produced more tomatoes than they could sensibly consume and a respectable quantity of corn and beans, and Frances preserved everything she could and traded the surplus with the Pattersons and the other families near their land. She continued her bookkeeping work for Patterson's store, riding into town 3 days a week, and had taken on 2 additional clients in Caldwell, a land agent and the new hardware merchant who had opened in spring. The work was hers, entirely and independently, and it gave her a financial footing she had never had in St. Louis and which she was determined to keep. They argued sometimes, as people who live together argue over small things mostly, the placement of furniture and the management of the household money, and once, significantly, over a decision Clayton made about a contract with Grady that he had not consulted her about. That argument was the most serious they had, and it lasted the better part of an evening, and went to bed unresolved and was picked up again the next morning over coffee when they were both calmer. "I make decisions about my work," he said. "I know that," she said. "But we are building this life together, and decisions about how much of your time and labor you commit to Grady's operation affect both of us. I am not asking to manage your professional life. I am asking to be part of the conversation." He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was taking her seriously. "You are right," he said. "I am sorry. I have been making my own decisions for a very long time, and it is a habit I need to break in certain areas." "I am not trying to take your independence," she said. "I know that," he said. "Give me time to adjust." She did. He did. The next time a significant decision arose, he came to her with it first, sat down with it across the supper table, and laid it out and asked what she thought. And the ease with which they talked it through showed both of them that the adjustment was not as difficult as the habit of solitude had made it seem. By autumn of 1880, Frances knew she was expecting a child. She told Clayton on a Tuesday evening when the harvest was in, and the evenings were turning cool again, and they were sitting on the porch of their own house, with the plains going dark around them and the first stars coming out over the grass. She had been thinking about how to say it for several days, turning the words over, uncertain of how she felt herself, which complicated the telling. She was happy, she was certain of that, but she was also aware of a particular kind of fear that she recognized as the fear of a woman who has been let down before and who is afraid to be too glad of anything lest it be taken away. She told him straight, because she was not a woman for circling around things. "I am going to have a child," she said. "Our child, in the spring, I think." He turned to look at her very slowly, as though quick movement might disrupt something fragile. Then his face did something she had not seen before, opened completely, became entirely unguarded in the way that only very large feelings can produce. "Frances," he said, "I know," she said. "Are you all right?" "I am," she said. "I am also afraid." "Of what specifically?" She looked out at the stars for a moment. "Of wanting this too much, of something going wrong, of not being the kind of mother I would like to be." He reached over and took her hand slowly, the way he always did, as though her hand was something of real value. "You are going to be extraordinary," he said, "and I will be beside you. And if something goes wrong, which it may not, we will face it the same way we face everything else." "One day at a time," she said. "One day at a time," he agreed. She leaned her head against his shoulder and they sat in the dark with the autumn night around them and the quiet awareness of the life beginning to grow between them, which was its own kind of silence, warm and full of possibility. The pregnancy was not easy in the first months. She was ill in the mornings with a thoroughness that disrupted her work schedule and her sense of her own competence. And she disliked it intensely because she was a woman who needed to feel functional. But she managed it with the same methodical approach she brought to other problems, determining what she could eat at what times and adjusting her routine accordingly. Clayton helped without being asked, and without making her feel diminished by needing help, which she would later tell him was one of the things she loved most about him in that period. By December she felt well again, and the pregnancy was visibly established, and Mabel came out to visit and examined her with the experienced eyes of a woman who had delivered children in necessity, and pronounced her healthy and the child well-seated, which was good enough news to celebrate with a cup of Mabel's excellent ginger tea. Christmas of 1880 was held at their house for the first time, a small gathering of the people who had become their community. Mabel and Elias, the Pattersons with their 3 children, Agnes the schoolteacher who had become a genuine friend to Frances over the year, and Herschel Grady, who sat in the corner with his coffee and watched the proceedings with an expression of bemused contentment. They ate well and sang badly and told stories, and the children of the Patterson family discovered the barn and had to be retrieved, and it was warm and chaotic and entirely good. Frances sat for a moment alone in the kitchen while everyone else was occupied and looked at her hands resting on the round swell of her abdomen and thought, "I did not know I could have this. Not just this, the house and the people and the particular joy of an evening like this one, but the capacity to be here for it." She had arrived in Caldwell a year and a half ago as a woman who had shut herself down in self-protection, and she was not that woman anymore. Or rather, she was still herself, still cautious and independent and occasionally difficult, but the doors she had closed were open now, and the light coming through them was warm. She heard Clayton's voice in the other room, answering one of the Patterson children's questions with patient seriousness, and she smiled at her hands. Today, she thought, and the today after this. The boy arrived on a clear March morning in 1881, after a labor that lasted most of a day and the whole of a night, and that Mabel attended along with the town doctor, a compact, efficient man named Dr. Hale, who had delivered half the children in Caldwell. Clayton was not in the room because that was not the custom, but he was outside the door the entire time, which Frances was aware of and found steadying in a way she could not fully explain. They named him Robert, after no one in particular but because they both liked the name, and he arrived in the world with a quantity of dark hair and an impressive opinion of his own situation, loudly expressed. Clayton held him for the first time that morning in the bedroom while Frances watched from the bed, exhausted and deeply awake in the way that extreme tiredness sometimes produces, and the expression on Clayton's face as he looked down at his son was one of the things she was certain she would remember for the rest of her life, reverent and wondering and absolutely undone. "Hello," Clayton said to the baby, very quietly, as though they were having a private conversation. The baby blinked at him with the unfocused attention of the newborn. "Robert," Clayton said, as though testing it. "Robert Donovan. That is a very serious name for such a small person," Frances said from the bed. "He will grow into it," Clayton said. He brought the baby to her and she held her son for the first time and felt the particular completion of it, not the end of anything but the beginning of a chapter so new she could not yet read its language, only sense the enormity of it. Robert grew with the robust energy of a child raised in the open air, and the particular stubbornness of a child, whose mother had stubborn opinions about how things ought to be done, and whose father had the patient, immovable quality of a man who has spent years working with animals that weigh a great deal more than he does. He was not quite 2 when he discovered the horses and decided immediately that they were his primary interest in life. And Clayton, predictably, was delighted by this and began the careful, methodical process of teaching his son that horses were to be respected as well as ridden. Frances continued her bookkeeping work through Robert's early years, bringing him with her to the Patterson store on the mornings she could not make other arrangements, where he developed an attachment to the candy jars on the counter that Mr. Patterson indulged with what Frances considered excessive generosity. She expanded her client list further, and by 1882 was keeping the accounts for 5 Caldwell businesses, which gave her a professional independence that mattered to her deeply, and which Clayton took genuine pride in. The Grady spread changed hands in the summer of 1882 when Herschel Grady, at 71 and with no children of his own, sold to a younger man named Theo Buchanan, who was expanding his cattle operation up from Texas. The transition was handled fairly, and Clayton negotiated a foreman's position with Buchanan that came with increased wages and a higher degree of responsibility than he had held under Grady. The work suited him, and he was good at it, managing the operation's logistics and the other men with the same combination of competence and fair dealing that had always defined his character. Grady himself retired to a small house in Caldwell proper and became a fixture at the breakfast table of the restaurant at the end of Main Street, holding court with a rotating cast of ranchers and merchants and townspeople, and Frances made a point of going to see him regularly because she had grown genuinely fond of the old man, and because she knew he liked having someone to talk to who would tell him honestly when his opinions were incorrect, which she did with regularity and which he appeared to enjoy. The summer of 1883 found Frances expecting again, which she received this time with more equanimity than the first, not because she was less glad but because she knew now what the experience held and was less frightened of it. She told Clayton across the breakfast table one morning, with the same directness she had brought to the first announcement, and he looked up from his coffee, and his face did the same thing it had done before, that complete opening, and she thought that a man whose face did that when told he was going to be a father again was a man worth every careful, frightened, brave step she had taken since that spring morning she had ridden into Caldwell. "Boy or girl, do you think?" he asked. "I have no idea," she said. "Do you?" "I have no knowledge of such things," he said, with the slight smile that she had catalogued over the years and still found reliably devastating. "But I find I am very glad either way." "As am I," she said. The child was a girl, born in February of 1884, with Frances's green eyes and Clayton's dark hair, and an immediate and imperious demand for attention that made Robert, who was nearly 3 and very interested in being a person of importance in the household, somewhat put out for the first few weeks before he decided that having a sister to present information to was actually useful, and transferred his allegiance to her with complete sincerity. They named her Clara, and she was from the beginning a person of pronounced opinions and considerable charm, which Frances considered the best possible combination. The house they had moved into in 1880 had grown with them, a room added in 1882 when Robert was making his presence in the main bedroom more complicated than restful, and another addition in 1884 when it became clear that 2 small children and 2 adults in 3 rooms was a structural problem requiring structural solutions. Clayton and 2 men from the Buchanan spread built the addition themselves over a summer, and Frances fed all of them and kept the accounts for the materials, and managed the chaos of small children and large construction, with an efficiency that made her husband look at her sometimes with an admiration that was so uncomplicated, it made her laugh. Caldwell changed around them through the years, as frontier towns did, growing in some ways and shifting in others. The cattle business remained central, but the town's nature was evolving, more settlers, more permanent structures replacing the rough-built establishments of the earlier years, a school where Agnes taught with iron dedication and considerable love, a proper newspaper, a telegraph office that Elias ran with quiet competence, and Frances suspected considerable knowledge of everyone's business. The Indian Territory to the south remained a constant presence in Caldwell's awareness, and the complex and often unjust dealings between the federal government and the various native nations in that territory were a matter of ongoing tension that seeped into the town's conversations and politics. Frances had opinions about these matters that she did not keep entirely to herself, which caused occasional friction with some of Caldwell's more comfortable residents, but she had never been a woman who prioritized comfort over honesty. Clayton agreed with her on most of it, which was something she had learned to appreciate rather than expect, because agreement between two people with minds of their own is not given but chosen. In the spring of 1886, Robert turned 5 and was enrolled in Agnes's school, an event he regarded with the serious deliberation he brought to most things, and Clara regarded from her position on Frances's hip with enormous 2-year-old interest in everything her brother was doing. Frances stood outside the school on Robert's first morning and watched him walk through the door with his spine very straight and his hat in his hand, a gesture so unconsciously reminiscent of his father that she had to press her lips together for a moment. Clayton came to school with them that first morning, which he had arranged by leaving the Buchanan spread in the capable hands of his second, a steady young man named Garrett whom he trusted. He stood beside Frances on the street and watched their son disappear into the schoolhouse, and then looked at her with an expression that held a great many things: pride and wonder and love, and the peculiar bittersweetness of watching your children move toward the world. She put her hand through his arm, and he covered her hand with his, and they stood there in the May morning while Clara wriggled impatiently between them, and a warm wind came off the plain smelling of grass and distance. She had not promised forever. She had promised today. But today had accumulated, one after another, into something so large and solid and real that she could not imagine the shape of the world without it. Without the weight of his hand over hers, without the sound of his voice in the morning, without the particular way he looked at her sometimes, even now, 7 years into their life together, as though she was still something he could not quite believe he had the good fortune to find. She turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her, and she thought of the evening on the boarding-house porch when she had been so afraid, when she had sat in the blue evening and told this man that she could not promise forever, and he had said, "Start with today and we will see." She had started with today, and she had seen. The summer of 1886 was a good one, long and golden and full, and in its evenings Frances and Clayton sat on the porch of their house after the children were in bed and watched the stars come out over the Kansas prairie, and talked about everything and nothing in the easy, layered way of people who know each other well enough that conversation is both unnecessary and endlessly pleasurable. He told her once, on a particular evening when the sky was doing something extraordinary with color, that he thought some evenings were so good they ought to be somehow preserved, kept somewhere safe so you could return to them. "You cannot preserve them," she said. "No," he agreed. "You can remember them," she said, which is almost the same thing. "What do you remember?" he asked. She thought about it genuinely, leaning back in her chair with her face toward the darkening sky. "The wildflower," she said, "the one you brought me that you said you had found in a field east of town." He was quiet for a moment. "I picked that flower out of the field behind Mabel's boarding house," he said. "There was no field east of town. I was trying to seem less obvious." She turned her head to look at him. "You were terrible at seeming less obvious." "I was," he agreed cheerfully. She laughed, full and unguarded, and after a moment he laughed too, and the sound of it went out into the summer night and was absorbed by the enormous quiet of the plains. And above them the stars continued their ancient indifferent business. And below them in the house their children slept with the deep, absolute confidence of people who are completely safe and completely loved. And Frances thought, today, this exact one, is one she would keep. The years continued to lay themselves down like the rings of a growing tree, each one adding depth and solidity to something that had begun as the tentative, brave choice of a frightened woman to try one more time. Robert grew into a serious, capable boy who had his father's patience and his mother's precision, and who, by the time he was 10, could do basic accounts and help his father manage the horse herd with equal competence. Clara grew into exactly the person her infancy had promised, bright and willful and full of an energy that filled whatever space she was in to its corners. And Frances loved both of them with the full-throated, uncomplicated love of a woman who had once been afraid. She had nothing left to give and had discovered that love, when it is allowed to exist in the right conditions, does not deplete but grows. In the autumn of 1888, Frances found out she was expecting a third child, which arrived the following spring in the form of a second boy they named James, who came into the world apparently determined to be as different from his siblings as possible, being cheerful and sociable and entirely uninterested in precision of any kind, preferring instead the kind of enthusiastic, imprecise engagement with the world that kept Frances in a constant state of affectionate exasperation. Clayton, predictably, found James's personality delightful and somewhat familiar, and when Frances pointed this out, he did not deny it. By 1890, Caldwell had changed enough that it was sometimes difficult to see the rough frontier town she had ridden into 11 years earlier beneath the more established settlement it had become. The saloons were still there, and the cattle trade still moved through, but there were also now 3 churches, a proper bank, a millinery shop, and a lending library that Agnes had single-handedly browbeaten the town council into establishing, and that Frances used with dedicated regularity. The wild, open frontier quality of the place had not entirely disappeared, but it had been overlaid with the beginnings of something more settled, which Frances supposed was always the direction things moved. She and Clayton sat on the porch one evening in October of that year, their coffee cups cooling in the autumn air, the children inside doing various things that produced a low, comforting hum of activity through the closed door, and she felt the weight of the last decade in a way that was entirely pleasant, like a quilt that has been used long enough to be perfectly soft. "Do you remember," she said, "that you told me on the very first morning we had coffee together that you thought about what you would do when you were too old to sleep on the ground?" "I remember," he said. "What is your current thinking on the subject?" He looked out at the plains, which were going blue and gray in the autumn dusk, the grass bent by a wind that had the first edge of real cold in it. "I think," he said, "that I am not yet too old to sleep on the ground, but I vastly prefer not to." "That is very specific thinking," she said. "I am a very specific man," he said, with a small smile. "I think that I would like to continue doing exactly what I am doing for as long as I am able to do it, and that the doing of it is considerably better than I had any reason to expect it would be." She looked at him sidelong. "Are you talking about ranching?" "Among other things," he said. She put her coffee cup on the porch railing and leaned her head back, and looked at the stars beginning to appear over the darkening plains and felt, completely and without reservation, that she was in the right place and the right life, and that the woman who had ridden into Caldwell in 1879 with her broken heart and her borrowed pistol would be, if she could somehow be shown this evening, genuinely astonished by how well things had gone. "I could not promise you forever," she said, picking up a thread she sometimes returned to because she found it worth examining. "No," he agreed. "I was right that I could not promise it," she said. "Because promises about the future are beyond anyone's actual power, The future is not something you can promise. No, he said. But I can tell you, she said, that right now in this present moment I would make every choice again, every single one from the boarding house porch forward. He was quiet for a moment. Even the argument about the Grady contract. He asked, and the way he said it, with that exact calibration of seriousness and warmth that she had loved in him since the beginning, made her laugh. Especially that one, she said. You were wrong and I was right, and you knew it, and I was right, and the world became a better place for the discussion. The world became a better place for a great deal of things, he said. She looked at him. It did, she said. He reached over and took her hand slowly, as he always did, as though it were still something precious, and she thought, it has never become routine for him. The years have not made the gesture automatic or careless. He still means it every time. She turned her hand over and held his back, feeling the familiar texture of his palm, the calluses and the warmth, the hand of a working man and a good man and her man. And she thought that there were a great many things she could not promise, that she had been right about that the future was always beyond the reach of promises. But there was this, today, and the today that followed it and the one after that, laid down in a long bright line across the years like a path through the grass, each one chosen, each one real. She had started with today. She had seen. And what she had seen was worth every terrified, brave, wide-open step she had taken to get there. The porch lamp flickered in the autumn wind, and through the door came the sound of Robert and Clara arguing about something with the amiable persistence of children who argue for the pleasure of it, and James's laughter rising above both of them, and Caldwell settled into the cool October evening beyond their fence line, and the stars came out over Kansas one by one in the enormous, unhurried dark, and Clayton Donovan held his wife's hand in the lamplight, and Frances Wilcox, who was Frances Donovan now and had been for 10 years and would be for all the years that followed, held his back, and there was nothing unfinished between them, nothing owed and nothing withheld, only the full and present and deeply ordinary wonder of a life built together on the accumulated weight of 1,000 chosen todays.